Or good morning, good afternoon, whatever. This is the fourth lecture that we're doing on world civilization. And this one is going to be about one of the early and very important civilizations, and that of Mesopotamia. Now, what we did in the last lecture is we looked at the emergence of civilization. We looked at the agricultural revolution, brought about apparently in part by climate changes. People learned to domesticate plants and animals. That meant that they could stay in one place. Villages could form, villages could grow into cities, and we had a new way of living. It's also, by the way, known as the Neolithic Age, the New Stone Age, to distinguish it from the Old Stone Age, or the Paleolithic Age. So we looked at civilization, why it developed. We also looked at some of the characteristics of civilization, that it is going to be organized, it's going to have classes, it is going to be a civilization or something which produces writing, which produces a record of itself. It's going to be a more complex society. There's going to be less freedom, perhaps, for individuals, more of a class structure. We also looked at some of the effects of it, including the growth of trade, more interaction among peoples, and the growth of war, the growth of warfare, made more possible by civilization and the settled populations. What we're going to look at in this lecture is we'll start looking at a particular civilization. The way your textbook is organized, and it's a good organization, is to look at particular civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and India. And we'll get to those in the course of the next few lectures. Now, civilization develops, the city environment develops in Mesopotamia. That is the first place where it develops. All right, and what we're going to do is look at Mesopotamia and some of the civilizations that came out of there. If you look in your textbook on page 28, there is a rather good map, and maps can tell you an awful lot, so use them. Don't be afraid of them. If you look at the one on page 28, it shows you ancient Mesopotamia. And you can see on that map there's a green band going through the center of the map, which is called the Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent is going to be the center of Mesopotamian civilization. Obviously, it's going to be a very fertile area. It is watered by two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Now, we've heard a lot about the Tigris and Euphrates in recent years because it's in Iraq. And the United States has fought a rather long war in Iraq. There were references to troops at the Tigris and the Euphrates. We are very much aware of this part of the world now. So what happened with Mesopotamia is, again, that this is one of the first areas where we had agriculture developing. Ancient Mesopotamia for a long time was shrouded in some mystery. We really didn't know very much about this whole part of the world. Up until, the early 19th century, the references that we had to Mesopotamia came from a historian, a Greek historian named Herodotus. Herodotus was a great traveler, and he's kind of a gossipy character. So he picked up a lot of news and information about this part of the world. And Herodotus does describe some of the living in Mesopotamia. We also knew something about Mesopotamia from the scriptures. Mesopotamia is going to have the Babylonian peoples. It's also going to have some of the Assyrians. And as we'll note, there are references in scripture to these people as they came in contact with the Jewish people. But up until about the early 19th century, we really didn't know much about ancient Mesopotamia, and especially about the Sumerians. And again, this is a case of where archaeologists went digging, and they began to discover this earlier ancient civilization in Mesopotamia called Sumer, or the Sumerians. And it was, again, quite by accident that they began to rediscover this ancient world. You know, a lot of what we know about these ancient civilizations is fairly recent. We know more about these ancient civilizations than people living in the 16th, 17th, 18th century because of archaeology. And we're still learning about these civilizations. Sometimes people will say, well, it's easy studying history because nothing ever changes. Well, that's nonsense. Things change all the time. We make new discoveries. We find new sources. We come up with digs, or we discover new places. We also, as we look at the past, get a different interpretation sometimes as we get new information and as we ask different questions ourselves. So ancient Mesopotamia, it's fairly new in terms of our historical knowledge of it. If you look at that map, again, there is that Fertile Crescent. When we talk about ancient Mesopotamia, we're really talking about different peoples. There are the Sumerians, and we're going to talk about them in a moment, but there are also going to be the Babylonians. And again, we know about the Babylonians, certainly through Scripture. If you recall from some of your Old Testament courses, for example, it was the Babylonians who carried off the Jewish people in their captivity. It's also going to include the Assyrians, and the Assyrians were fierce, warlike people. And again, from your Old Testament classes, you may recall it was the Assyrians who conquered one of the Jewish kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel. They wiped that out. We're also going to be talking a little bit, and you can see this on the map, about the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were part of Mesopotamia as well. So when we're talking about Mesopotamia, we are talking about different peoples. We're not just talking about one Mesopotamian type. There are different peoples who come along in this part of the world. One thing we're also going to notice as we look at Mesopotamia, and I've sort of mentioned it a little bit already, is that this is a troubled area. This is where you have one group coming, surviving for a while, and then being overthrown. We have the Babylonians coming, they overthrow the Sumerians, and then the Assyrians come, and the Assyrians are overthrown by the Babylonians, or overthrown by the Persians. It's sort of wave after wave of conquerors. And again, this sort of gives us some pause to think about this part of the world. Even today, we still have those troubles. Why were they fighting in ancient times? Well, again, some of the causes that we looked at when we talked about war. This was a rich area. It was a rich agricultural area. You can imagine people living in perhaps a more barren area being attracted to come to Mesopotamia because the food, the domestication of animals, it was better, easier to live there. So that attracted peoples. Also, what would attract people is that the geography. The geography was fairly flat. It was easy to invade this area. And from time to time in history, you'll find certain parts of the globe where there's almost constant warfare because it's so easy to invade. And this is going to be one of the characteristics of Mesopotamia. So when we look at this civilization of Mesopotamia, again, we're going to look at things such as how do we know about it, our sources. And historians love Mesopotamia because we have written records here. And that's one thing historians like, is to get written records. And that's why in the beginning of that chapter it says history begins at Sumer, because we have people discovering or inventing writing. And this was really one of the great breakthroughs in human history, writing, to come up with a system of writing. And again, we don't know who invented writing, who came up with this idea that when you can make marks that stand for something else, marks that stand for a particular sound, particular thing, and they can put together a system of writing. And again, if you just think about it for a moment, if I said, come up with a new writing system for the next class, where would you begin? How would you start? We benefit from these people because they have done a lot of this hard work for us. We can advance in our own civilizations, our own technology, because a lot of the tough work has already been done. The invention of language, the invention of writing. So what we have here with the Sumerian peoples, and they are the earliest people that we can trace in Mesopotamia, is the invention of writing. Probably to keep government records, maybe for religious purposes, but they begin to come up with a system of writing. So historians really enjoy that source. We also have with Mesopotamia the other suspects in our ancient sources. There are writings, there are inscriptions, there are physical remains, animal bones. As you have countries going to war, having victories, there are inscriptions or monuments which they put up. So we have those that we can read as well. As we come along with civilization too, one of the great sources that we have, it sounds perhaps a little bit trite, but it's very important, is pottery. Pottery came along with civilization. As you had the production of agriculture, people would have a surplus, so they want to store it. So what do you store it in? Well, you need pottery. And they begin to develop, all right, pottery. Now, if you think about it, even if they had pottery in the Paleolithic age, just imagine trying to wander around with all those pots and carrying all that surplus with you. It wouldn't be practical in the Paleolithic age, even if they had pottery. With the Neolithic age, so if you're settled in one spot, okay, you can store your grain, you can store the food. And so pottery comes along, and they develop the techniques for producing pottery, and that helps them preserve their agricultural surplus. Pottery is also a great source for historians because pottery, well, it was easily broken, but you couldn't destroy it. Pottery would sort of last forever. And so there would be bits and shards of pottery that archaeologists still come up with. They can look at pottery, they can determine the level of skill of the peoples, how it was made, what designs we find on pottery. They can also understand trade patterns. So if you find a bit of Babylonian pottery in Egypt, what do you conclude? Well, there must have been trade going on between the Babylonians and the Egyptians. So it can reveal to us things like that, the relationships among these people, the level of their skills as well. So pottery is going to be one of the great sources. There's also going to be, again, monuments. There's also going to be architectural monuments. It's interesting once you have this civilization, you find in almost all civilizations monumental building. What we'll find in the Mesopotamian civilization, especially with the Sumerians, they are going to build ziggurats. And there is in your textbook on page 33, right, a picture of a ziggurat. And what is a ziggurat? Well, it's a monumental structure, to say the least. It is sort of multiple platforms, one on top of the other, and at the top of it there is a temple for the worshiping of their gods. And it's monumental. It had these stairways going up 3 different directions. You find monumental architecture also in Egypt. We're going to see the pyramids, for example. And so once people begin staying in one place, they seem to have this need to build big, and we still build big today. What do we have countries in the world vying with each other to see who has the tallest structure, who has the biggest building? We still have that need to put up monumental structures. Why they did this, the ziggurat was probably for religious purposes. And here we're getting into something also with civilization, a development of religious ideas. It's hard to know in the Paleolithic age, did people have serious religious ideas? They maybe had some sense of some great powers or forces beyond them, but in terms of a formal religion or religious text, we really don't have that from the Paleolithic age. As I mentioned earlier, it's possible that some of the cave art that we've discovered from the Paleolithic age was for religious purposes. Perhaps there were some religious rituals, but we really can't get much of a handle on it. When we have civilization, we begin to see religious structures, we begin to see religious ideas developing among people, and you see that in the building of the ziggurats, which the Sumerians put up, that these were temples to the gods. They probably had some idea of the gods as being in control of nature. They would want to appease the gods in order to get good weather, to get good favor from the gods. They also developed priests, and your textbook talks about that. Priests who would work at the temples. Some of the priests could tell you perhaps the will of the gods. They might offer sacrifices. But what we see with the Mesopotamians is this sense of some powers beyond them, gods. Many of these gods were sort of had superhuman qualities, but they had to be appeased. So some of this architecture is going to be for the appeasing of the gods, for religious purposes. What other achievements do we see with the Sumerians? And they were remarkable people. All right, they gave us writing. They give us these monumental structures, the ziggurats. They also come up with the wheel. And we sometimes trivialize this invention, but the wheel made possible transportation. It also made possible, and you can see through the images in your textbook, once you had wheeled vehicles, you could have chariots, you could use the wheel to have these war chariots as well. The wheel is kind of, well, it's sort of basic to civilization, and we still sort of see it that way. How do you refer to your car sometimes? Well, my wheels, I gotta get my wheels. It's so very basic. And this was something else which the Sumerians came up with. All right, the Sumerians also came up with an irrigation system. And this sort of makes sense if you think about it, that they had these two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, but they could be very irregular, very unpredictable. Sometimes they would flood, other times they would be parched. And so what they had to figure out is control the rivers for their own agriculture, and they had to have irrigation projects. It shows a certain level of intelligence and ability to construct these irrigation projects. What it also shows us is that you have people starting to get some control over nature. And there's some historians who will say one of the big themes of history is human beings getting more and more control over nature. We saw with the Paleolithic age, whether they were at the mercy of nature. They couldn't control it, they couldn't change it, they couldn't alter it, they were at the mercy of nature. With civilization, you begin to have human beings starting to control nature with irrigation, even with their plantings, starting to put farms in particular areas, taking control of nature a little bit more. And so this is sort of a big change for human beings now, to be able to use and control nature. And we still do it ourselves today. We still have this control of nature, trying to overcome nature, trying to overcome the environment. You just think of Kentucky in the middle of the summer, how hot it gets. How would we manage without air conditioning? Heating, air conditioning, that emphasizes, again, some of our control over nature, overcoming nature. We don't just sit and bear it. We want to conquer it. We want to overcome it. And that's sort of characteristic, I suppose, of civilization and of Western civilizations as well. We don't stay at the mercy, of nature. So we have the Sumerians putting in irrigation. What it also means is that they have to have some organization, some structure. In other words, a government, somebody to control, somebody to direct. And this is also going to be very characteristic of civilizations. Some authority, some control, somebody to organize and to direct these projects. All right, these are the Sumerians. What we're going to look at in the next lecture are some of the other peoples in Mesopotamia, the Assyrians, for example, the Phoenicians, and you will find these people described in your textbook. Read.